Hey everybody, this is Professor Lilly, and I want to talk to you about the next project, the next assignment, which is going to be called the Online Fan Communities Research Project. You can see here we only have 3 more modules left. So we're going to do this one. I've titled this one Before and After Easter, um, just because you're I guess officially Easter break starts on Thursday, so I'm not going to send anything. In fact, this video is the only thing I'm going to send um, this week at all. So if you have any questions, then make sure that you email me, ask questions about this assignment. So I basically have constructed this assignment so that you can start some work in the next few days before Easter, and then do whatever you're going to do over Easter break. You can do some of the work that time. It's up to you, but there's not a requirement. And then you will finish it up in the couple of days after Easter break, once you return to virtual school, and then in the middle of next week is when we will start the final module called Tech Evolution Project before the final exam. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a kind of a mini condensed lecture on Chapter 4, and then I'm going to talk a little bit, or maybe not a little bit, medium amount of bit about the online fan communities assignment, and then I'm going to chime off after that. So as you can see, we start here because it's the middle of the week. Just in case you came here earlier, this reminded you that we wrapped up the Celebrity Social Media assignment on Monday night. So basically, I'm telling you here what to get done before your Easter break. Like I said before, if you choose to do it all in the next few days, that's fine. Or if you want to leak some of your work into the first few days into Easter break, that's fine. That's totally up to you. And then just what to do in terms of wrapping it up next week when you come back from Easter break. We're going to be using this wiki tool because we have problems with the discussion forum, and I'm going to go over those in a second. And then here's a little bit more detailed guidelines for the assignment. But before I get into that, I want to do a quick mini lecture on chapter 4, which is the chapter on community. And just looking at the ebook here, if you could focus on browsing through or reading the first section, or the introduction, and then the first section of communication and community, and then get especially into the end with the new kinds of community. Now, the middle sections here talk a lot, are focused on the role of different communication institutions in terms of helping to form different types of communities. So in the section here, talking about the African American press and or presses and their role in helping to define and create African American communities as populations of African Americans move from the South to the North, and kind of the role in helping to define, this is what our community is, and also in articulating different issues and problems in that community. And similar along the same line with immigrant presses that sprang up in America as other immigrant groups came here in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. But for our assignment this week, since we're looking at online communities, if you can focus on the first section, communication and community, to get some definitions, and then new kinds of communities, which is talking about virtual communities through kind of web technologies. Okay, so in the textbook, it also gets into these kind of philosophers who have thought a lot about community. And I will put in a little signage to remind you about when each one of these people was alive, and their kind of what was going on, their eras. But so with Aristotle, this is what we would call the kind of tribal phase. Granted, I mean, the Greeks are considered a more advanced society than a tribal society, but still, most of the countries or societies around that time when he was thinking were very tribal in nature. So he recognized that a lot of what held a geographic community together, or what made it a community, is this last word here, discourse. So sharing a language and just actually talking together and living an area together helped people to share a common sense of who they and what they were, so a common identity. Um, Rousseau is an Enlightenment era philosopher, and so he was thinking about in what ways different structures of society make things possible. So, for example, he recognizes that at that point laws are being developed to help keep private interests in check, to allow people to go out into the world and act on in social type of ways. So laws just to, like, for example, just to keep people from being lawless. Laws about private property, private space. The idea that the landlord or the king, the despot, can't just do whatever they want. To allow people to kind of flourish, and again, that's kind of makes sense in the Enlightenment, what was going on in Enlightenment at the time, in terms of history and also social movement. So Hegel, a couple centuries later, is really thinking about how communication allows us to recognize and think about people who are different than us. So he's writing in a time when the populations, like a kind of industrial revolution times, when there's wide scale commerce and bigger populations, more of society kind of as we know it today, and recognizing that without communication technologies, people aren't able to grasp a sense of communities that are beyond just their local area where they live. So, and this is certainly the case when we're going to talk about communication technologies as being vital for forming ideas of community, such as what a national community, for example, would be, or national identity. Dewey was kind of considered one of the godfathers of public education, and so for him, the idea that freedom of the press, of inquiry, of public education allow for people to be their full selves, and therefore help whatever they are able to achieve helps the greater society. And one of his principal concepts that he came up with is called civil society, which is still one that we use today, and I'm going to give you a definition for that in a second. And then lastly, Irving Goffman, and he kind of thought a lot about, well, how do people act in different places in society in their daily lives? So he had this idea of the presentation of self and everyday life. So his concept is that even though people don't realize it, they're always changing the way they perform or act in different social settings. So you all are very familiar with the way that a student acts, and you can kind of jump right into that role. I've been a professor for 20 years, so it's very easy for me to step right into that role of being a professor and what that means, right? So people are constantly, as opposed to when I go to the store or do something else, or when I'm at home, maybe I perform different sorts of roles. And so this concept, I think, is very important also when we start thinking of virtual, like online communities, and how people assume different ways of acting or behaving in those communities. Okay, so if we were together on campus, then we would start talking about, well, what communities do you belong to? And part of the idea here is to recognize that people feel like they're parts of different communities, right? So some of you might feel like you're part of different sports team communities, whether or not you're a fan or a member of the team. Um, Certainly, certain dorms have community ties that some people who live in the dorm might feel more a part of than other people. And these are all based on shared experiences, rituals, and so all sorts of different aspects of our lives are tied to our engagement and identity with these different sorts of communities. Um, and so one question that I have for you just to think about is how your communities changed since COVID, right? So I mean, right now you're right, not thinking so much about your dorm community, right, which used to be a huge part of your life for several months, once you got into school, but now not so much, right? So and even our geographic communities are changing, right? So my kids don't participate in sports anymore. They're not doing any kind of their clubs, even school. Granted, the schools are using different technologies to keep those community ties together. So perhaps you have greater engagements in some of the virtual, like computer-based communities that you were a part of before, but now maybe even more deeper part of. And but at the same time, your geographic communities are really important, right? So how are you finding information about which grocery stores are open and what are you allowed to do? Are you allowed to go out on hikes or not, or is that against some sort of ban? And technologies play huge roles and in fact, you're probably using technology in a different ways to find out about your communities than you were before the COVID quarantine. Okay, so with this in mind, we can ask ourselves, what is community? So, oh no, I got to go all the way back to the beginning. So we can recognize that it's not necessarily geographic, right? There's plenty of type of communities, like for example, um, I grew up near Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and the University of North Carolina is really big there, and I'm a big Carolina sports fan. I don't live there anymore, right? And there's plenty of alumni who don't live there anymore. So even though that community has a big geographic aspect, it's not just geographic, and there's certainly many communities of interest that don't necessarily have any particular geographic aspect to them. There's just technologies that tie groups of people together to focus on that issue of interest. Um, and it's not necessarily also common ideas, right? So, a geographic community could be tied together because people come together because they live near each other, but they don't necessarily have any common ideals that they share or values. Um, it could be, in many instances, it is common rituals or practices, but it's not necessarily just those things. Um, so, for example, in my wife's family, they're all big Ravens fans, and they all do certain things associated with being a Ravens fans. But I've certainly met plenty of Ravens fans who don't do those same things. So, um, common rituals and practices can be very important to communities, but it doesn't necessarily by itself make up a community. Um, so we can come down to this definition. A community is defined by the texts. Okay, so we're talking about media texts. A group of people produce ways they learn to pay attention to those texts and how they identify with these texts. And an important concept here is the idea of imagined communities, which the scholar Benedict Anderson came up with, and recognizing that our nominal kind of definition or understanding of what a community is, which is a geographic community, is not necessarily true. Even geographic communities are imagined in the fact that every person in that community has a different understanding of what that is. He came to this from examining the role of newspapers in the Revolutionary era before the United States became the United States. And first of all, he recognized that even the individual states themselves were huge geographic territories. So what makes someone feel like they're a member of a state? Like I'm a Marylander, as opposed to just someone who lives in a particular little town or a farm that's in a place that someone told me is called Maryland. And he recognized the role of newspapers in helping to define, okay, now we're in this place called Maryland, and Maryland has a particular interest, and we're going to raise particular taxes, and we have a governor, so on and so forth. Things that tie you to feeling like you're part of that place. And then he did an extensive study of the role of newspapers in helping to form the idea of a national community of the United States of America, partially through telling the history of how these battles are being waged against an external foe. So he also recognized that the other, defining what our community is or what we are compared to other people or groups of people, is also essential in that formation of that identity. So he basically recognized that all communities are identity based as opposed to necessarily geographically based. Um, One thing to throw in here also is a concept that you might have heard before, or two concepts: modern identity and postmodern identity. And these basically demarcate the role of global capitalism and also the role of nation states. So modern identity is closely linked to people's identity with national issues, national structures, or struggles, and we can think of think maybe more so of what a national identity might have been like in the age of your grandparents, right? So not a lot of people would have ever kind of left the United States, when they were growing up. Most of the media production that they would have seen, like music, television, would have all been about the United States and made in the United States. And anything that they learned about a country not the United States would be very much us versus them, or us as opposed to them. Postmodern identity is the concept that nowadays, with new media technologies, we have a lot of exposure to media texts that were not necessarily made in the United States, or just don't have any kind of identity or aspect associated with a national culture. So, and it's much more easy for all of us to, when we're kind of creating our own personal identities, the things that we like, the things that we have engagement with and make meaning for us, from all over the world. So, like I said here, your identity with a variety of influences from family, local, subcultural, ethnic, like all sorts of things, but also many different things from could be anywhere in the world, right? Which is a very different kind of experience than what your grandparents would have had. So scholars use the term postmodern identity to recognize that lots of people are drawing from all these different influences when they're kind of creating their own personal identities. Now, this comes up with the idea that from the book, a famous scholar came up with the idea of bowling alone, which was that he was worried that a lot of civil society aspects are kind of are not nearly as strong as they were. So the things that came together to help people to build modern identity, like going to church, maybe being part of a choir, being in Boy Scouts, local sports, sports leagues, all sorts of local and state level institutions to help people to develop their identity. This is all based on civil society. So I give you a definition here: the institutions and organizations of society that are independent from the government. Again, think about church and all sorts of groups like what did I mention? The Boy Scouts or 4-H or choirs or sporting leagues. Anything in those kind of arenas. And so his idea was that these things were starting to disintegrate. Usually when I have students talk about in this class and I ask them, what kind of groups did you belong to? And we discovered that, civil society is still pretty strong. But that doesn't necessarily mean that modern identity kind of still rules. I mean, you could be big part of geographic aspects of your community, but at the same time be drawing lots of your influences parts from media that was created well outside of your geographic area, certainly all over the world. So I think we're kind of an era where both of these are kind of vying for our attention and creating up helping us to create who we are in terms of our identities. So this gets us into the role of new communication technologies, and also the focus of the online communities research project for this week. And part of this gets into the idea of virtual communities. So when internet technologies first started becoming really, really popular in the 1990s, and communities of kind of interest started forming. So let's say you were really interested in I'm trying to think of a band, like maybe the Nirvana fan club. And at that point, maybe there are only so many people interested in that band who lived near where you were, but online discussion forums and or bloggers, websites were springing up where people can get together and talk about this community of interest that not a lot of people in your geographic community might be talking about. So another example that a graduate student of mine did a analysis of cancer survivors, right? And so there might not be so many cancer survivors that you might know in your community, but you can go online and find discussion forums and websites that use technologies to bring people together to talk about their common interests. And the scholars use the term virtual communities to talk about this. So I put in, I don't even know if I spelled Fortnite right there. I don't play Fortnite, but that's an example of a community, and it's really talking to my son about it. I think it's multiple communities because you can set up your own servers, and there's different types of campaigns or games that you might play, and certain groups of people who might gravitate towards playing with one another. But still, they use the technologies to bring them together, which is why we call them virtual communities. Certainly, there are many communities that are both geographic and virtual. So at the bottom, social media, for example, are used to extend both geographic and virtual communities. So right now, you are, right now you're all still part of the Loyola community, but you're not geographically together anymore, right? So you use social media to stay engaged with that community. Even in normal circumstances, you would be more geographically tied and learning about and engaging in the community that way, as opposed to virtual internet technologies. So let me give you an example of a fan community that you could research. So the idea in the research project is to find or to identify a fan community that you're interested in, and to research how they what technologies they use to get together, what kind of things they talk about, what kind of things do they do online that make them a true community. And in this example, I think this is a Game of Thrones example. Let me see. So I would identify myself as a Game of Thrones fan. I read the books like really early. As soon as they came out, a friend of mine told me about them. And then obviously I was a fan of the television series. And in this example, and a few years ago, I went online and started realizing on YouTube there's literally hundreds or thousands of these fan created videos. Some of them are designed kind of to be more kind of viral, funny videos. Others, like this one, let's see how many people have watched it. It's been around almost 10 years. And so I guess 43,000 is kind of a lot. The production value is pretty low, right? And if you're not familiar with the television series, you would look at this and be like, what the F? What am I looking at? It makes no sense, right? So it only makes sense, this video, and it's funny, I think, for people who are parts of this fan community. So one of the things that kind of defines, well, what can be a virtual community or a community at all is to have common text to draw from. So the common text here is not the books, but recognizing the main characters, and for the person who created this video to kind of throw them on top of this. I don't even know what this the video is, the dance video. I'm not sure if it's a mashup or if it's from a popular music video. I'm not sure, but so just seeing the faces and kind of these funny poses is only of interest, right, to the fan community itself, because it only makes meaning to them. So having common text to draw from is one of the main aspects of what a community, whether or not it's virtual or geographic or both, what helps to make up that community. Okay, so that's the end of the lecture there, just to give you some context, some things to think about for this assignment. Okay, so let's start from the beginning here. Well, actually, let's start with the specific guidelines down here. So what I want you to do first is to get a post up on your wiki. So there's two wikis here, one for the first section and one for the second section. So make sure you post in the right section. And I put them in between the article that you need to read. So at the beginning of the article, I mean of your post, I do ask you to let's see, I have it right here. To write a few sentences about that essay and how what the main points of basically of that essay. So the essay looks at some examples of how people have defined what a religion is, and it asks the question of, so these online fan communities and the ways they function with common texts, with rituals. Several of the main aspects of how a scholar would define a religion. So she asked the question: are they technically religions, institutionally speaking, or not, just based on these definitions? I mean, and she's not necessarily asking, are these things they're talking about godly? I mean, she's talking more about religion and a sociological aspect. So don't get hung up on, that she's not saying that they really are religions in terms of a belief in a God, but they do kind of are predicated on a belief in something, right? The greatness of the texts that these fans are focused on. So I think it's a very interesting read. And most of the things that you will want to kind of define in the first section of your research are in the first few pages of the article here. So read that. And then I've given you an outline. So the second thing you want to do is you want to decide what community do you want to focus on. So I already gave you the example of Game of Thrones. So, and you don't necessarily have to be a fan of that community, or like, for example, I don't know if, like, for me, calling myself a Game of Thrones fans is kind of weird because I don't really engage with other fans. Like every once in a while I might meet someone who's read the books and who has watched this TV series, and so I can talk to them in depth about it, but I'm not necessarily looking to go online to have those connections, right? So am I a member of that community? I would say only marginally, just because I'm familiar with the text, but I'm not going online to engage with that community. So, but still, I could certainly do more research. So you don't have to be an in-depth fan of anything. I would probably recognize or recommend you focusing on something you are somewhat familiar with, because you're going to have to find the places online where that community engages, because the technologies could be all over the place. So, for example, Harry Potter fans, there are all sorts of Instagram accounts where people post only about Harry Potter all the time. There's discussion forums, there's websites, there's blogs. There's YouTube fan videos. There's all sorts of things. So it's really scattered all over the place. So you're going to have to kind of have some ideas of where to look. I've had students who have done, this is the second year I've done this assignment, and I've had students who did sports teams, fans. I've had last year a student did Beliebers, Justin Bieber fans. Here is an example I found from last year. A student did Ariana Grande. Um, and I just wanted to bring this up because I like the way that this is using the blog tool, but you can, no, this is, yeah, this is a wiki. I guess I used the wiki last year too. So I like the way that she set this up by first saying, okay, here's who I chose and where I kind of have found the information. Then she puts a screen capture here. If for screen captures, the best way to do something is to make a screen capture and then to go to whatever, like let's see, I wanted to make a screen capture right here, and in Mac and PCs it's different, so I'm just going to make a generic screen capture. If I go to preview, okay, it's open, and just do new, and it automatically just puts it in there. And so if I could just go to here and say save, and I'll save it as a JPEG, and then once I save it as a JPEG on my computer, then in the wiki tool, you just hit the little tree sign for inserting an image, and you can insert it in there. So I like that when she has that, and then she puts a screen capture in here, and then in this section she gets the definitions from the reading from the essay on how you would decide if a fan community is like a religion, like how that works and what kind of definitions, what things are we looking for. Like I said, having sacred texts is one of them. And putting places to meet up, rituals. So again, go to the essay and get those. And I like how she has the specific page numbers. Then she has another photo, more screen captures, and then in the last two paragraphs, she's getting into her kind of observations and of the community. What is it that makes us a true fan community as opposed to people who just kind of like Ariana Grande? And part of it has to do with their social media engagement. So this does kind of dovetail with what you learned about social media engagement in the last assignment, and then she kind of concludes here at the end. The only thing I think that would be lacking from this one is I wish she had some links in here to like maybe some of the main Instagram accounts in the places where she found her information. But she does give obviously the page numbers from the article. Um, so yeah, so first of all, you have to find a good topic. So when you go to create your wiki, um, and you create your new page, and the name, make sure you put the name of the fan. So if I was going to do it, I would say Game of Thrones fan community, and then I would just put my name. The wiki tool is nice because I mean all the same things in terms of formatting, inserting photos, inserting links. You can insert a put a YouTube video in there, and then you in all of your so you can have up to 3 people in this group, and you can all come back really easily. I'm gonna save this even though there's nothing in it. Once there's a lot of people in here, make sure you just first when you come to it, go to pages, and then it'll just show you like there'll be these yellow or orange bars like one after the other. And right now it only shows mine because I'm the only one in there, and it's just really easy to come in here and go to edit. So any member of your group can edit, and that's why I mean that's common to like the whole idea of wikis is like any person who's a member can edit. I'm gonna hit cancel there, and then I'm gonna delete this one. Yeah, Yes, I want to delete it. Okay, so the idea is that you would have an initial post. So before you kind of leave for Easter, even if leave for Easter is more of a mental or scheduling aspect, because most of us aren't going anywhere. But get your initial post up there that says, this is what my fan community is that I'm focused on, and maybe say what a few of the places like you're going to be observing. Like, I found this Instagram account, this blogger, and there's lots of stuff on YouTube. Like I said, all this stuff is all over the place. And you're definitely not just looking, and actually you're mostly not looking at that. Like, if it's a star or a celebrity, you're not looking at their stuff at all. You're only looking at the fan community itself. So if you're doing Ariana Grande, you're not looking at her social media. You're looking at the fan community's engagement with itself. And then go ahead, if you have time, and go ahead and put your definitions in there. And then that's what it said about before Easter. And then after Easter's over, come back and put any additional observations, photos, links in there. I have given you one thing that I noticed about the celebrities' social media was that there was a lot of variation in how much people put. So a few people just put like a paragraph and a photo or two. Others have like mini paragraphs and a whole bunch of photos, and that's fine. I mean, that was kind of a warm-up exercise for this one and the last one, which is the technology evolution project. But I've given you kind of a goal for about 250 words total. This doesn't have to be written, like I said, before Easter. You can wrap it up in the days after Easter. And that's fine. You do not have to comment. I think I said that somewhere. Yeah, so comments are optional for this. I mean, if you see someone, you can make comments in the wiki tool. And if you see someone who's writing about a fan community that you know or you're part of, then you certainly can chime in there and say, hey, check out this blog or this YouTube channel or this Instagram account, like help them out. But other than that, it's optional to do anything like that for this assignment. So I think that's it. If anyone has any questions, then please email me. I hope you enjoyed this topic. So pick something that that you're interested in. But again, remember, we're focusing on critical observations, critical thinking. So really think hard, and that's why reading the essay is important, because it really gives you those kind of like scholarly kind of notions to really focus on and think of when you're analyzing your fan community. So have a great Easter, and as always, please email me if you have any questions about this project or about the course in general or anything. So take care.